late 1920s. The first documented incident was the Bath Schoolhouse Massacre in 1927. Still to this date, the deadliest U.S. school massacre in history in the United States, where the gentleman there didn't use a firearm but used dynamite to kill 38 and injure 58. But since then, we've had the Texas Tower incident, University of Austin, Texas. Probably many of you remember that, when Charles Whitman, a United States Marine Corps officer candidate, someone who had gotten or received accolades for being a marksman, and also got a good conduct medal, shot and killed 14 and injured 32. But since then, we've had a ton of them. Paducah, Kentucky, Jonesboro, Arkansas, Springfield, Oregon, Richmond, Virginia, Virginia Tech, Columbine. They just keep happening and happening. We've had well over 100 incidents in the last 15 years. In California alone, we've had Stockton, Oliver, San Diego, Santee, Sacramento. They just keep going on and on. So with Columbine, obviously in 1999, we had a big shift in our response tactics. That was the one where law enforcement had to really open their eyes and recognize that traditional response tactics of isolating, containing, evacuating those in harm's way or line of fire, and then negotiating wasn't going to work. Active shooter incidents are a whole new animal for us. So whereas time, teamwork, tactics, and negotiations work really well in a traditional crime in progress, a traditional barricaded suspect, a traditional hostage situation, it's absolute failure in an active shooter situation. So we changed our tactics after Columbine. Everybody did. Nobody, no longer will officers isolate, contain, and stand by for a SWAT team to arrive and resolve the situation. It's really incumbent upon the first responders to employ what we refer to as immediate action and rapid deployment. That's where the officers are going to get in there and use contact teams to locate and neutralize the threat posed by a suspect. When you talk about Virginia Tech, still, as you guys probably know from the recent media coverage, still the deadliest single gunman incident in United States history, where I can never pronounce his name, Soho Cho or whatever it was, killed 32 people. With Sandy Hook Elementary, though, last month, where Lanza killed 26 and injured 2, it brings to the forefront the continued need to, look at our emergency action plans, consider the components of an action plan, talk about our response capabilities, again, revitalize and refresh those relationships with our partners, maybe rewrite or refresh some of those MOUs, but talk about what it is we can do to make sure we're doing everything possible to minimize the risk to our school districts and our children. So that's what we're here to do today. I didn't mean to take over too much. As necessary, I will jump in and throw some comments where you see fit.
Very good. Thank you, Randy. As Randy alluded to, that these active shooter incidents are very dynamic. And that's not necessarily a positive thing when we say dynamic. These are generally not contained and are constantly evolving. The actions, usually of the suspects, sometimes victims, bystanders, and even officers. So suspects can go in, they can start killing people, they could decide once they know that emergency personnel have arrived, they could normally commit suicide, they might decide to take hostages. Victims can also change the dynamics of this. As you can imagine, when emergency personnel are coming in and you have death and destruction all around you and people are grabbing at your legs and you're trying to address the situation, you have bystanders, maybe somebody who lives across the street, hears things that are going on and decides to take matters in their own hand, grabs their shotgun, runs across the street. Emergency personnel are coming in, knowing that there's an active shooter. Don't know who's who. We just know that there's somebody shooting up the joint. And we don't know how many, and there may be a possibility that this person with a good intention ends up getting killed or seriously injured by emergency personnel responding to the scene. So as you can see, it can evolve, it can change in a blink of an eye. And these active shooters typically engage in targets of opportunity that are unaware, unprepared. They're not looking for a firefight. They're not looking for something that has a strong security presence. Usually the locations contain large numbers of people, typically unarmed and unsuspecting. and their areas of choice, schools, shopping malls, and workplace violence. We'll touch on a little bit about that. And so with that, I am going to turn this portion of the presentation over to Sergeant Chris Mora, who is our sergeant assigned to the Elk Grove Unified School District, and he supervises 10 of the school resource officers that are assigned regionally throughout the Elk Grove Unified School District, and he, in fact, has experienced an active shooter situation, and I'm sure he will touch on that, so thank you.
Good morning. Like Lieutenant said, my name is Chris Mora. A little bit of this is going to be review from what Randy just talked about. Columbine happened in 1999. Like Randy said, it set the new standard for our response as law enforcement to how we were going to react to an active shooter. Since then, we have completely changed the way we respond, and like Randy says, we no longer wait for a SWAT team to arrive. We engage quickly. 2007, that was the Virginia Tech incident. 32 people were killed. That's the most people that have been killed within recent times. I mean, other than what Randy spoke about, 32 people lost their lives that day. And then we come to Connecticut, which honestly, it just rocked this nation to the core. This set a new standard when a subject is willing to kill kindergartners. Recent incidents, Barrett Middle School, 12 hostages were taken. That was in North Sacramento. One of the sheriff deputies from Sacramento County negotiated and talked the child into giving up. No one was injured in that incident. 2003 was Rio Cazadero. That's a school within the Elk Grove Unified School District. I personally was there along with 4 other guys who currently work for me. Can't replace experience. I remind Chief Jenkins of that all the time. There's 5 of us now who have actual experience in the active shooter. And then Schnell Elementary in 2011, up the hill, Highway 50, where a custodian killed the principal. Sorry about that. And here is a map since 1966 of all the active shooter incidents in the nation and a few in Mexico since 1966. And I'd like to introduce Randy Wynn. I was told you're speaking.
Okay, what else would you like me to talk about? Okay, so I guess the whole thing, I don't want to get too much into tactics for you guys because that's really not going to affect you too much. But as they identified, it's really incumbent upon the arriving resources to get inside and immediately deploy so we can mitigate the threats posed by an active shooter. If we delay, it's going to result in additional casualties or death. We know that. So we use that immediate action and rapid deployment protocol to get inside, go directly to the source of the threat and try to deal with it. We refer to it, it's our soft and sanitized word of neutralize the threat, but that could be anything from talking them down, arresting them, putting handcuffs on them, up to and including actually killing them. Now, one of the things you probably don't think about a lot, but we do, is our rules of engagement in deadly force. And I just want to give you some insight into that so you realize what this means in an active shooter situation and how and why it's different from a regular law enforcement response. Every agency in the country, use of force policy, deadly force in particular, comes from the United States Supreme Court decision in Tennessee v. Garner. It's a 1985 case. It basically says when it is appropriate. It clarified the fleeing felon doctrine, if you remember that back in the day. Officers had the authority to use deadly force to take any felony suspect into custody. But subsequent to this case, where a burglary suspect was shot in the back of the head and killed as he fled from a residence, the Supreme Court intervened and wanted to modify that somewhat. In doing so, what they said was there were certain instances where deadly force was appropriate and necessary. One, anytime an officer reasonably believes he's in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death, or 2, an officer believes somebody else is in an imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death. That's the typical uses of force you may see on TV on a nightly basis, particularly in Sacramento County, or these officer-involved shootings within our region. But there are actually 2 other categories that we should discuss, and that's where active shooters come into play. The next one is to effect the arrest, recapture the escape, or prevent the escape of somebody the officer has probable cause to believe committed a violent felony. Okay, certainly that would include carjackings, robberies, rape, forcible rape, of felony assaults, particularly stabbings and shootings, and particularly active shooter incidents. The next caveat is if the officer has cause to believe that the felony suspect to be apprehended may cause additional serious bodily injury or death if he gets away. Certainly fits in an active shooter incident. So you got to recognize that the mindset for an officer going to an active shooter call, we identify those by incident indicators, and I'll talk about that in a moment. If an officer goes to an active shooter call where there's bloodshed, carnage, and death, multiple calls, okay? Location, if it's occurring at a school, I mean, unfortunately for you folks, the first box is checked. If it's occurring at a campus or an institution where you work, the first box is checked. We're already thinking, could it be an active shooter incident? But for law enforcement officers, it could be any public venue, movie theaters like Colorado, sporting events, any mass gathering of people or children or personnel, and we refer to those typically as soft targets. When you talk about kindergartens, that's the ultimate soft target. Sometimes I get up, I see a shining object, and I get distracted. But what was I talking about? Somebody help me. Use of force. I'm sorry. And he said deep. That's my cue not to go so deep. So what I wanted to do, though, is tell you the difference between a traditional response and an active shooter, only because for our officers, this is different. This is a situation where the suspect doesn't need you to give you a reason to use deadly force. This is a situation where the suspect can have to give you a reason not to use it. So if these suspects don't immediately surrender and throw down their guns upon confrontation, and chances are there's going to be law enforcement shots fired. Okay, that's how we're going to mitigate these threats. We don't have time to negotiate when there are potentially more than one suspect running around on your school campus and injuring or killing your students. Okay, so that's one of the components. When I talk about incident indicators, again, location of the incident, number one. Okay, again, unfortunately for you, the box is checked on the schools. But again, any public venue. Next, how many calls did we get? Are we getting multiple 911 calls? People indicating there are shots being fired. It's ongoing. The situation's not contained. The suspect's has injured multiple people. They need multiple ambulances. The next one would be access to additional victims. That's actually in the definition of an active shooter incident. We know those traditional crimes in progress, the barricaded suspects and the hostage situations caused maybe by a crime interrupted, such as a bank robbery. We know, again, those are best handled through time, teamwork, and tactics and negotiation. But these particular situations in active shooter are not. Any time that we don't utilize to take the situation under control or seize the initiative could be exploited by the bad guy. Okay, he's going to kill more people. So if it's ongoing and not contained and the suspect has access to additional victims, that's a major component. And then the other one we sometimes see is some diversion tactics. Some of the more sophisticated or well-planned incidents involve suspects who called in something else somewhere else, away from that particular area, district, or division of your first responders to get our resources going to an explosion or a mass casualty car crash or a train wreck somewhere else, so that when the actual thing occurs, the incident occurs where they're going to be, officers aren't in the immediate presence. Now, some of the mitigating factors, again, in the definition, has access to additional victims. So if for some reason the suspect no longer has victims, because I guess what I got to illustrate for you is that not all shots fired calls where you're present or where officers are on scene are active shooter incidents. In fact, after our initial training for law enforcement personnel in '99 with active shooter, we actually saw the pendulum swing too far to the other side. Every time an officer was on scene and a shot got fired, somebody called active shooter and the officers were rushing into the situation. That obviously exposes our officers and even you, the public, to substantially more risk, so we don't want to use those tactics when they're not necessary. So some of the mitigating factors, if there are no longer any victims, maybe the suspect has run out of victims, maybe he's killed everybody, maybe the victims have sheltered in place or self-evacuated, he no longer has access to them, or he has maybe he's run out of ammunition, or maybe his weapon has malfunctioned, or maybe what else? He no longer